Hello and welcome to today's webinar on using the US Federal Census. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs here at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation is Lindsay Fulton, Director of Research Services here at NEHGS. Lindsay joined the Society in 2012, first as a member of the Research Services team, and then as a genealogist in the library. In addition to helping constituents with their research, Lindsay has also authored a portable genealogist on the topics of applying to lineage societies, the United States Federal Census 1790 to 1840, and the United States Federal Census 1850 to 1940. She is a frequent contributor to the NEHGS blog Vita Brevis and has appeared as a guest on the Extreme Genes radio program. Her areas of expertise include New England and New York research with a focus on lineage society applications. So the U.S. Federal Census is often the go-to resource for family historians researching ancestors from the 19th and 20th centuries. But do you know how to get the most out of this valuable resource? In today's presentation, Lindsay will go over some census basics and shortcomings, plus provide tips and tricks for more fully utilizing these records. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. Lindsay will answer as many as she can in the time provided. There is no handout for today's presentation, but if you click on the icon of a camera in the upper right hand of your screen, you can take screen captures. We're also recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can easily go back and review any of the content from the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Lindsay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on using the United States Federal Census. I'm very excited to be speaking about this topic. As a former genealogist on the reference desk here at NEHGS, I've had many experiences with patrons and clients of research services using the Federal Census. And the most important detail that I'd like to say is that I think most people have found at least one record of their ancestors on the census. But in some cases, you are not looking at the full census record or using it to its fullest potential. So today, I'm hoping to speak to you about this and hopefully give you some pointers on maybe some census records that you weren't aware of. So the first thing that we need to talk about is what is the census. The census is a document that is created by the United States government. It was authorized by Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, and it is to make an accurate count of the United States population. This is for representative purposes. Now, we still take a census to this day. It's done every 10 years. The last census that we did was on the 1st of April in 2010. We will do another one on the 1st of April 2020. And this it first occurred in 1790. That was the first census that they could take after the Constitution was ratified in 1787. So the first one that we have was enumerated on the 2nd of August, and just to be clear on one specifics on that, the Vermont census was actually taken in 1791 because it was not a state yet in 1790. The next census to become available, which is going to be the 1950 census, will become available by the National Archives on the 1st of April in 2022. It's going to be very exciting. I've actually seen some of the questions that were asked on the 1950 census. It's going to be very in-depth. I'm looking forward to it very much. In addition to that, it's important to note that the jurisdiction of the census was first under the U.S. State Department. That was until 1840, and it currently is under the U.S. Census Bureau. So what is the census going to tell us? Well, depending on the year, it can reveal a multitude of information. And as time progressed, the census actually became a tool for political policy. And questions were asked to get a better understanding of the population of the United States. So what was the infant mortality rate? What is the education level of our constituents? What is the veteran status? Did you fight in a particular war? In fact, in 1930, there was a question about whether or not you owned a radio. So in these cases, the census has become a great tool for genealogists going forward to learn more about their particular ancestors. And they started out slow. So if you want to just look at the 1790 census really quickly, it's basically a tax list, just a quick representation of the folks that are living in a particular area at a particular time. So this is just a quick example of the town of Braintree. Just a quick listing of the heads of household and then the population of that particular household. But by 1940, so after 220 years of taking the census, things have progressed over time. So in 1940, you can see a quick example. This is the last census that we have available to us. Much more information was recorded. Names of all members of the household, whether or not they were married, their relationship to the head of house, where they were born, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great way to use. So those newer censuses are a better way of getting an understanding of the snapshot of the family. Now, when using the census, it's important to understand what each census will tell you about your ancestors. So if you're trying to find information about immigration or a person's parents, where that place of birth may have been, or how many children that person had, there are specific censuses that give you this information. And censuses from 1850 onward will provide all of the information for each of the household members by name. Anything that was taken from 1790 to 1840, they become a little bit trickier. Not everyone is named, so people tend to, or researchers tend to ignore, I don't want to say ignore, but they tend to avoid using those 1790 to 1840 census records. But that shouldn't be the way that it is, because these censuses are just as inclusive as the 1850 to 1940 censuses. While everyone may not be named, everyone should have been counted. So your ancestors may have just been a tally mark, but it's still important for you to realize that your ancestors will be on those censuses just as they were on the 1850 to 1940 census. Now, because these censuses are less used, I'm going to speak specifically about each of these census years just to give you a better idea of what these censuses can offer. So beginning with 1790, which is the census that does not provide us the most information, I will admit that. It's the head of household, the number of free white males, and they divide that into categories of under 16 and 16 and over. There are categories, there's a column there for the number of free white females, as well as slaves and free white persons. And that's it. And this is actually an example of a very neat form in 1790. The census enumerators did not have printed forms at that point in time. So this ends up being bigger because Braintree was a larger area. But in some cases, you're going to get a census in 1790 that's just a piece of paper where there's no headers on the top. That's very common. The census enumerator was using their own paper. So it could be really on any size piece of paper without the header there. Now, by the time we get to 1800 and 1810, we get a better understanding of what the household looked like, as long as we're talking about white males and females. There was no information given on gender or age for slaves or free people of color in 1800 and 1810. Those folks were just counted. Now, if we're speaking about free white males and females, those categories are divided into under 10, 10 to 15, 16 to 25, 26 to 44, and then 45 plus. So while it's not a great representation of the family household, this information can be used to learn a little bit more about your family members. Now by 1820, we actually start to get additional information. The categories for white males and females stayed the same, but more detailed information is included for slave and free persons of color. So those categories were now, for free persons of color and slaves, was under 14, 14 to 25, 26 to 44, and 45 plus. This census also included information about persons that were engaged in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. So if you know that your ancestor was a farmer or a businessman, and you're trying to distinguish between maybe two people in the same area with the same name, this column can actually be used to give you a little bit more information about the makeup of the family. Additionally, 1820 has some other little hidden gems. There's a column for white males between the ages of 16 and 18. There's also a very small but important thing to mention is that the census enumeration for the 1820 census began on the 7th of August, 1820. Now, the enumeration began in 1830 on the 1st of June, 1830. So there was not a full 10 years between those census records. It was actually 9 years, 9 months, and 25 days. So technically, anyone born between the 1st of June, 1820 and the 7th of August, 1820 would show up in 1820, in the 1820 census, they would show up as under 5 years old. Now, by the time we get to 1830, they're going to show up as under 10 years old. Now, while this doesn't seem significant, it does, if your ancestor was one of those folks who was born in that two-month week period, 2 month and 1 week period, then you can narrow down their birthday to that very specific time. So just something to keep in mind going forward. There's also information on the 1820 census about foreigners who are not naturalized. And we can see that on the next slide here. There is Thomas Johnson, who is right towards the bottom here. And in his household, there are several members of his household. There's young boys. There seems to also be some young females. But in this column right here, there's the number 1. So what this tells us is that there is one individual living in this household who is of foreign birth, who is not yet naturalized. So this is significant because in 1830, they are asking this same question. Therefore, if there is a 1 in this column in the 1820 census, and then moving forward in the 1830 census, there is no tally mark, and the same amount of people live in the household, it's safe to assume that that person may have naturalized in that 10-year time frame. Now, this also means that they've gone through the naturalization process. So Thomas Johnson may have filed his initial papers, but maybe not gone through the entire process at this point. So something else to keep in mind. So if your ancestors are indicated in one of these columns, you may want to try to find a naturalization record for them. Also, interestingly, is military-aged men, which would have been males between the ages of 16 and 18, which they would have been born about 1802 to 1804. And they're going to be included in both columns. So right here is the 16 to 18 column. And then there's also this 16 to 25 column. So if there's someone that is listed there, so if we look at William's household here, there's one male who's listed as being between 16 and 18. But there are 2 males between the ages of 16 and 25. Therefore, one of those males that was 16 to 18 is counted again in this column here. So it's not that there are 3 boys of that age, there's only 2. Something, again, to think about going forward. this gives you a better idea of someone's specific birth date. Now, 1830 will include some more specific information about male and females, as well as their age ranges. So for free white males and females, there's categories for under 5, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and that keeps going by 10-year increments all the way up to 100 plus. Additionally, the columns are the information for slave and free persons of color also changed to under 10, 10 to 23, 24 to 35, 36 to 54, 55 to 99, and 100 plus. And as I was saying before, with the 1820 census, the 1830 census also has a column for foreigners who were not naturalized, white persons who are deaf or dumb, and there's a age range and gender given for that. I'm sorry, there's an age range but no gender. White persons who are blind, again, no age or gender. Slaves and free colored persons who are deaf and dumb, and then also a category for those who are blind. So if you have information about your ancestors suffering from any of these afflictions, that may be something that you would want to look for going forward. Now, the information for this is not included on that original page that we were looking at, and this is something that I just want to be clear about going forward, is that you are looking at the entire record. So 1830 and 1840 are typically the two censuses where folks are not aware that there's a second half to the record. So if we look at a search page on Ancestry.com, so this is the initial page that came up for that last record that we were looking at. Now this is the page for free white persons, both male and female. The people who are enumerated either as slaves or free colored persons is on the second page. So if you page forward using one of these toggles here, you can see that there's more information for the slaves and free persons of color. Also, the additional information about people who are deaf, dumb, or blind are in these columns towards the end here. So again, something important to think about when you're looking at census records online is that you're looking at the entire record and not just that first page. Now, another tip for you is that the head of household is not always the oldest male or the oldest female in the household. And this is assumptions that researchers make all the time. Is because the head of the household is usually the oldest male, doesn't mean that it's always that way. Or the oldest female. So we need to keep that in mind when we're researching going forward. So if we look at the 1840 census, and I'm just going to draw your attention to the second person down here. His name is Hiram Lawrence. And you can see that Hiram has very young children living in the household. These young boys. He also has some young females living in the household. But there's also this older female between the ages of 80 and 90. Now we know that Hiram is traditionally a male's name, so most likely the person listed here is Hiram, who is this male between the ages of 40 and 50. Now, an interesting feature of the 1840 census is that pensioners, so people who were receiving a pension, either a soldier, a widow, or a child of that particular soldier, if they were receiving a pension from the United States government, they are listed in this column here. So you'll see that in Hiram's household, that older female is Elizabeth Lawrence. She's noted as being 87 years old. So we can determine that she was born about 1853. So most likely she was the widow of a Revolutionary War pensioner. Now, what's important also is that there's information about free white persons who are also deaf, dumb, and blind, using an age range but no gender. That also happens for slaves and free persons of color. Now, when we look at some of the census records, you can obviously tell that in some cases there may be folks with very common names living in the same area, maybe that have families that are around the same size and the same age ranges. So this is just something that we came up with here at NEHDS to help navigate using some of those older censuses. Now, I'm going to speak specifically about the 1830 and 1840 censuses, but this is something that can be done for all of the censuses that do not include all of the members. So from 1790 to 1840, we have made these forms up, which you'll see in a little bit, so that you can compare those two households. We didn't do one for 1790, and we weren't able to do one for 1820, but maybe that will be in the works going forward. But this is just some tool that we've come up with to help you navigate using some of those older censuses. So I'm going to use an example from my own family. This is Nicholas T. Wharton. He is my fourth great-grandfather. He is a native of Spotsylvania, and this is coming from a biographical mug book from an Illinois county history. So I had been unable to find Nicholas in some of the older census records, and I was hoping that this, in conjunction, using this with several other records that I have, most notably some find a grave information, to get to know this family and then also their migration pattern. So I can tell from this description of Nicholas and his family that he was born in Spotsylvania in Old Virginia, so Virginia, and that his father was Benjamin Wharton, and that his mother was Lucy Chandler. And there's information in here about them settling eventually in Gersony County, and that was in 1837 in Ohio. So using this information, I tried to find them in the 1840 census. So if we look at the I came up with a few different options. Now, Wharton, I should mention, is a very popular name in Virginia, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start in Ohio first and then move back to the Virginia area. So if we see this 1840 Gersony County on the bottom here, there's a Benjamin Wharton. And you can see that there are very young children living in the household, young boys, also some older boys, and there's an older gentleman and an older female. So all of that looked pretty good. And then when I look at the breakdown, the family breakdown that usually is given by Ancestry.com, I just made it neater so it all fits on this particular slide. Everything seems to match fairly well. I know from other records that Benjamin was born in 1790, so he would have been about 50, so he's showing up nicely here. Lucy is 46, so she's showing up nicely here. Martha is 26, again, everything's looking pretty good. We have John, who's 24, Benjamin, who's 20, which that's one of the columns that maybe is a little bit off, but because he was born in 1820, give or take a few months, depending on when the enumeration was, can explain this away. George would have been 18, and then here, William and Nicholas would have been 14 and 12, respectively. And then these younger children also makes sense. I have an ancestor whose first name is Doctor, and Doctor would have been about 10, so that he may have been 9 at the time of the enumeration, and then Lawrence would have been 6. So, as a researcher, when I look at this entire family breakdown, I can make sense of it, but it's not visually appealing, nor is it easy to follow. So we were hoping to come up with some sort of comparison chart that would help with this. And this is an example of when I would fill out what we had for the 1840 census. So this is 1840. The census day was on the 1st of June, 1840, something to keep in mind. Folks should have answered questions based off of that day. So even if the enumerator came later on in the year, so if they came in December of 1840, everyone should be answering the question as if it was the 1st of June, 1840. Didn't always work out that way, but that was the initial instructions there. Now you can tell based off of what I was just explaining and then these birth years on the side that everyone fits nicely into each column. Now when we're going back to 1830, all of these individuals should fit into the column to the left. So like this, so Lucy Chandler should be here in the 1830 census if all goes well, which hopefully it will. So if we look here at the 1830 census, which was in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, we are looking for Benjamin Wharton, who is right here. Again, young children in the house, as well as himself, and then what would most likely be his wife. So everything looks pretty good. It's in the right location. I've got the right Wharton. So I was using, again, the comparison chart to make sure that this is the same family. So when we compare that, we can see that Lucy Chandler shows up in the right column very nicely. So does Martha. Benjamin is a little bit off, but I'm okay with that because he was born supposedly in 1790. So depending on the census day, it's possible that he would have been, he could potentially have been 39, about to turn 40 on that particular day. The same is true with John and Benjamin. John fits nicely. Benjamin would have been right on the cusp, which was exactly what happened in the last census. And then same with George here. George could have been a little bit older or younger, depending on the census day. But everything looks pretty good. So looking at this comparison chart, I'm very confident that the record that I found in Spotsylvania and the record that I found in Guernsey County, both of those seem to match. I'm confident that these are my Benjamin Wharton. So if you are as excited about these comparison charts as I am, we do have them available for download for free on our American Ancestors page, our education page. We have these different comparisons here, 1800 to 1810, 1810 to 1820. We don't have 1820 to 1830 because the age ranges changed so much between those two time frames. We haven't been able to figure that out yet, but hopefully we can in the future. We also have 1830 to 1840, and we did that for both free white families, free colored families, and slave families. So as I was saying before, it's very important to keep in mind that of the census day and the enumeration day. So in some cases, the enumerator will indicate the day that they showed up at someone's front door. And that would be the census day, or that would be the enumeration day. The census day is the day that is established by the, depending on whose office it was under, but if it was the US Census Department, they picked that particular census day. So this is just a chart showing how the census day evolved over time. In 1790, they were taking it in August. They were doing the same all the way up until 1830 when they switched it to June. And then presently we take the census in April. So it's important to know when that census day was. So now that we've covered all of the censuses where not everyone is included in the household, I'm going to quickly go over the 1850 to 1940 censuses. Now, because these censuses ask so many questions and include so much information, I'm going to just highlight 4 of the most widely used, or the ones that changed that changed some of the questions for going forward. So 1850, for example, is when we first see everyone enumerated. So, and I should be clear about this, is that the 1850 census is the first to enumerate by name all white and free colored people. This is not, it's not going to include names of slaves on this. But the nice part about the 1850 census is that it provides us with an individual's age, place of birth, their occupation, their gender, the value of their real estate if that's owned. This census tends to be where everyone starts, and that's completely understandable. It gives the most information about the household, including family names. So it's understandable if you start here. In every census going forward from 1850, the entire household is going to be named. It won't just, we're not going to revert back to the 1840 census with the tally marks. By 1880, one of my favorite censuses, because of my experience in lineage, this is one of my favorite censuses, because it's the first that identifies the relationship between the head of household and everyone else in the household. So from 1850 to 1880, we're basically assuming that the entire household is related, or that they're an immediate family. It's very possible that some of those people living there are cousins, aunts or uncles, maybe sharing the same surname, who are about the same age as some children. So you always want to be careful when you're looking at those older census or those younger censuses, the 1850, 1860, 1870 censuses, that they might not have, or they're not going to have specific information about the relationship. This also provides information on the parent's place of birth, which is done in this column here. This is the father's column, and then this is the mother's column. Again, very important in lineage society applications. It gives you an idea of where to look for parent information. The 1900 census is everyone's favorite. It's the pick of the litter. It gives you a lot of information, a lot of genealogical information about a particular person. It gives the exact month, which is in this column here, and then the exact year of birth. It also gives their age, whether or not they're single or married. There is information about the children born to a particular person. So in this column here, we see that Ada has had 5 children. And then this next column is how many children are living. So there are 3 children that are living. So we can infer from this that 2 of them have died. And in this case, because we have that information, we can now look to see if there are some death records for children of Ada and Eli. This census will also give you information about street name. That was actually the first included in the 1880 census, but the 1900 census will include street name as well as the house number. Finally, the 1940 census is the most recent census that we have that we're able to look at. Due to privacy law issues, this is the most recent one that we're allowed to view. And it includes lots of information, just like the 1900 census. It is limited. It does not include information about parents or parents' place of birth, but it gives a fair amount of information, and there's actually 3 different features of this that are unique to the 1940 census. One is you'll see this little circle with an X in it. That is indicating who answered the information. And this is the first time that this has happened. In all of the other censuses prior to this, there was no indication of who was answering the questions. So in this case, we know who screwed up if we're not getting the right information from the particular person. Also included on this, now on there's technically 2 sheets to the 1940 census, but there's not duplicate information on that previous sheet. So it runs from 1 through 80. And then this sheet is 41 through 80. So you'll see on the bottom the number 80 here. Now the reason that I'm pointing this out is that in row 55 and in row 68, If someone falls under those rows, additional information was included about them. So in this case, Rosemary Kennedy was the person who fell on that row 55. So on the bottom here, there are supplemental questions asked for that particular person. And that can include information about parents' place of birth, languages spoken, the veteran status, occupation questions. So if you were lucky enough, and there's about 5% of the population that's included in these, there was additional questions asked of those rows. The previous form that was 1 through 40, or 1 through 40, would have included rows 14 and 29. But you can see that they jut out here. And those are the people who are included. Finally, this census includes information about where someone was living in 1935. That's included in this row here. So just something to think about that can help you trace a family over the years, especially in city directories. If you're trying to determine when a family came to a particular location, it can be helpful sometimes to look at this column. Now, all of these questions are included in both of my portable genealogists. They're on the back page there. So if you wanted to get a better understanding of the specific questions that were asked for each census year, these are 2 resources that might be helpful to you going forward. It's also a nice little quick way to look what censuses will be helpful for a specific question. So if you wanted to know what censuses have immigration information, that might be something, or it will be something that will be helpful for you going forward. So now to talk about the common problems, and everyone has their story about a census issue, and in some cases the problem may have been on the census taker side, and on other situations it may have been the person that was providing the information. Now, the most common of the mistakes is misspellings, variant spellings, nicknames, or initials. That tends to be the pinnacle of the problems that happen with the census. Now, that can be for 2 different reasons. There was an enumerator that wrote down everyone's information. In some cases, that is misspelled. In other cases, the person who's transcribing it, so the modern day person who's looking at the census record and indexing that record, they may have misread the record, misunderstood the record, whatever it may be. They may have mistranscribed that. So in that case, it might be very difficult for you to search for a particular name if that person reading the record screwed that up. So that's the most common of the mistakes. However, it's important to note that in some cases there's boundary changes, there's creations of states, sometimes there's multiple enumerations of a family. The language barrier is an issue as well. Families may have moved during the enumeration, or they may have been absent. So in all of these cases, we need to keep in mind that there are very common mistakes that always happen with the census. Now, one of the most important ways to understand this is how it was tabulated. And as a historian, this is something that I was especially interested in because it tells us a lot about the record that we're looking at, or the record that we're using to determine things about our family members. And it's evolved greatly over the 220 years of its existence. The first person that you need to be aware of is the enumerator, so the person who is in charge of taking down the information about your ancestor. They are a federal employee. They were assigned a specific district or a region. Now, if they kept that specific region or district is another question, but they were told to only go in a particular area. Now, that might explain why someone's missing from a record. So if 2 enumerators were confused and they missed a section of a city or town, that's definitely possible. It would depend, or they actually could have been enumerated twice if both of those enumerators were confused. It's important to note 2 specific things. One, they did not ask for spelling or proof for any of their questions. So if the enumerator arrived at the door and said, "Are you a naturalized citizen of the United States?" and you said yes, they would write down yes. They didn't ask for naturalization papers. They didn't ask for any proof of that. They were just taking your word for it. Additionally with that, they didn't ask for spelling. So if someone has a very difficult to spell last name, or if someone was, if English was their second language, or maybe if they didn't even speak English, that wouldn't have been given to the enumerator. So they would have been giving their best guess as to how that was spelled. And the second important part is that they were not furnished with a translator. So again, when someone is maybe if someone had a very difficult to spell last name and they were not using English as their first language, it could have been a child that was translating for their parents. It could have been that the enumerator was just guessing on the spelling. So we need to be very aware of the fact that spelling may be an issue. Now they were also given specific instructions, the census enumerators, and in some cases that was literally how to walk down the street. So these are instructions for 1920, and it's to how to walk down a city block. So the starting point is here. They're going to go down 2nd Avenue, then they're going to go down Forest Court, and then they're going to go east down Forest Street. Now this is the way that they should have walked around each of the blocks. So as long as the census taker was doing their job correctly, everyone should be enumerated. However, I'm sure that you can all imagine that in some cases that did not happen. They were given specific questions to ask. That's why all of the censuses should be exactly the same. And they were also given information on how to compile and how to file their information with a supervisor. And here's where I became very interested. The census enumeration instructions, which you can look at them at the census.gov/history website, all of the census instructions and the questions are included from 1790 until the most recent census in 2010. So something fun to look at going forward. But as far as we're concerned, the census instructions gave information on how to compile and how to file. So in 1790 to 1820, there was a multi-step process to filing the enumeration. So the assistant or the enumerator would take the original enumeration. From that enumeration, they would make a copy. They would hang the original enumeration and a copy of that schedule in two of the most public places in town. And that was so the folks in town could double check the census taker's work. They could make any corrections if necessary. And once that was approved, it was then sent to one of the schedules, was then sent to the marshal. Now we don't know which schedule was sent to the marshal. There's no way to indicate that. There's several details that you can look at the particular record to see if, whether or not it was a copy, but in most cases we cannot tell. But that copy was then sent to the marshal. The marshal was the supervisor of the assistant. And that marshal would then file a statistical report with either the President of the United States. The first census, the 1790 census, was filed with him. The 1800 to 1820 censuses were filed with the Secretary of State. But then there was a copy that was filed with the county court. Now here's where things become a little interesting. I was told when I first started doing genealogy that the reason that we don't have full copies, or all of the states are not included in the 1790 to 1810 censuses, is because the British burned down the records in the War of 1812. Well, that's just not possible. Because up until 1820, all of those records were still at the county courthouse. It wasn't until 1830 that everyone was directed to transmit the 1790 to 1820 census to the Department of State. So if your courthouse or if your ancestors' county courthouse did a bad job and they maybe threw away those original records, or they lost them, or they misfiled them, or they put them out in the rain, doesn't matter. We don't have them, and we're probably not going to have them because they would have been forwarded in 1830. So just something to keep in mind. Now, when we look at a particular example of a census in 1810, this is in Leiden, Massachusetts, we can tell that this is a copy of the original enumeration. And how can we tell this? Everyone is living in alphabetical order, which is not probable. In fact, mostly not possible. So now it's not exact alphabetical order, but you can tell that all the C's are together. You can tell that all the D's are in the same order. So if we were using the 1810 Leiden census, you cannot use this to determine neighbors that may have been related or who maybe lived next door to your ancestor. This is definitely a copy of that original 1810 record. So there are definitely consequences to making copies of these censuses, and this would have been hand done as well. So in some cases, I'm sure that enumerators would skip a couple steps. I'm sure that they didn't think that we would be looking at this 200 years later. So I'm sure that there's some issues that I can't even identify. Now in 1850. To 1870, things changed a little. The assistant was still taking the original enumeration. That original enumeration was then filed with the county courthouse. The county courthouse would keep a copy, but they would also make their own copy and send that to the state. Now, that means that the original assistant, the person who wrote down all of the enumerations, was not the person making the copy. So I'm sure that you have had this experience looking at someone else's handwriting. You may not have been able to read it as well as that initial person. So this is something to keep in mind. Also of importance is that the state or the territory, depending on the time frame, that Secretary of State made a copy, and that was either filed with them or it was sent off to the US, the centralized United States office. Now, the census record that you see today, the one that's on Ancestry.com or our site or any other site, that's the federal copy. That's the one that ended up in DC. It's just important to note. So, if we are to look at an example of, let's just say, the 1860 U.S. Census from Washington County, Maine, we can see that on so these are two census pages. They are from the same town. You can tell on I'm going to tell you, on the right is the federal copy, on the left is the county copy. And you can tell that the handwriting is somewhat different. The page number is the same, but you can tell that someone else copied this record. Now, in this case, this is important because the county court copy has additional information on it that the federal copy does not. So if we are to look at the federal copy on row number 30, there is Elmira Alley, and she's living with what is, most probably her children, her 4 children here. But if we look at the county court copy, we can see that there is Robert M. Alley living with Elmira, and that he is supposed to be omitted from the original or from the official transcription that goes to Washington because he is a prisoner. Now, I don't know if he's a prisoner, what he's a prisoner of, but he would have been enumerated in that prison. That's what the census instructions told the enumerators to do. So in this case, they're doing the correct thing. They're following the instructions. But for our purposes as genealogists, we would love to have this information. So this is why it's always important to go to the original copy. And in some cases, you can find the court copy. They should still be at the county court level for anything that wasn't distributed in 1830. So from 1830 to 1880, any of those copies should be at the court. Now, in 1890, things changed, and the assistant made the original enumeration. The enumeration went to the supervisor looked it over, and they sent it to Washington, and that was the whole route. So this is especially important because in 1890, the censuses from 1890 were lost in a 1921 fire. The majority of them were destroyed. Now, this is important because we did not make copies of the 1890 census. That was the first year that we decided not to do that because it was too large to make copies of. So in this case, it would have been very helpful if there was a county copy. However, there is not. So just to keep in mind going forward, 1890 is our end date. So anything from 1790 to 1880, there were duplicate copies made of that census. There may have been more than two. So it could be 2, could be 3 copies made of those census records. So in those cases, you should try to see if the county court has a copy of that original census, because like we were seeing with Elmira, there could be additional information on there. So where do we locate census records? Most everyone does it now online. So American Ancestors has an index, Ancestry.com has images of all the censuses, Family Search has a combination of indexes and images, but the National Archives has microfilmed all of the records from 1790 to 1940. It's important to note that the originals, the 1790 to 1880 originals, were sent to NARA, and the 1900 to 1940 censuses have been destroyed. So the WPA project took on microfilming some of these census records, and because they were so large, before they were transferred to NARA, the decision was made to destroy these records. So if you are looking at a microfilm of a 1900 census, that is the only record that exists of that census. The others have been destroyed. So some search suggestions. Most of the time, you can find, especially if a family is living in the same place for multiple census years, you can find a record. So it's less likely that your family will be missed, and more likely that the family was either transcribed under the wrong surname, or something was messed up with the spelling, and it's just you're not able to find it. So in some cases, you have to work really hard to find this missing record. There's a few search suggestions that I suggest. Using a first name only is one of the more common ways that I do this. I would highly recommend searching by a specific census year. So if you were trying to find them in the 1880 census, make sure that you are searching specifically in the 1880 census. Other ways to narrow this down is if you know a person's occupation. For some of those more modern census records, you can search that way. So if you think that, if someone has a surname that's mangled most of the time, if they have a specific occupation that you've seen over and over again, it might be worth doing it that way. You can also browse, and this is important to note for some of those earlier censuses. You can just choose the state and the county. And something important to mention as well is changing county boundaries or changing of a county name. So Ancestry and Family Search, to a degree, is very specific on a location. So if you're searching for a particular town, if that town was in a county or a different county in 1850, say, for example, it's going to search specifically for that town in that modern county, not the old county from 1850. So in this case, browsing is more helpful because you can force the records to look just at the state and then just at that county that you know that it was called in 1850. And then you just page through the records that way. You can also search by a specific location, and that you would do here in the lived in section. Now, like I was saying before, you need to be very weary of what a town or what a county was called at that particular time, because Ancestry will be very specific on that. But if the modern name is the same name that it was in 1900, if you put that into the lived-in section here, it will search the 1940 census for that particular location, and you might be able to find your ancestor that way. But I will show you an example of a way to search by first name only. So this, we are looking for a Thomas. We're actually looking for a Thomas McClutchy, which was spelled McCluthy, and I wasn't finding it. But I knew they had to be there. They were living in Boston, Massachusetts. They didn't really move around that much. It was a larger family, so I knew that I must have been missing something. So what I did was I filled in this first name. I put in Thomas. I put in the birth year of 1895, and I knew he was born in Massachusetts. But I forced it to look in Boston and Suffolk County, Massachusetts. And again, I can't warn you enough that if Boston, for example, wasn't in Suffolk County in 1940, then you couldn't do this. But in this particular case, it was, so this is appropriate. But also to search by the spouse's name, and the spouse's name is there on the bottom, Margaret, and I had it look exactly for that. So when we search for that, we find the first hit there is Thomas McChelsley. Close, right? The right spouse's name is there. The birth year is about right, so everything looks pretty good. But we always want to look at the original. We don't want to always look at the transcription, because there's a chance that the person who was transcribing it made a mistake. So when we look at the original record, you can tell that the person did make a mistake. It's very obvious that here it says McClutchy. There's no H there, that's an L. There's a Thomas, he's married to Margaret, John, all of that makes sense. And it clearly says McClutchy. So in that indicator, or in that case, it's because the transcriber had made a mistake with what we were looking at. And finally, there's a few more tips in my portable genealogist about how to search for the census, as well as steps in the enumeration process. If now I didn't go over all of them. I just highlighted two of the steps in the enumeration process as far as how many copies were made. So you can go to the American Ancestors website, and you can get that if you would like to.
All right, thank you, Lindsay, for your presentation. So now let's tackle your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Lindsay, please go ahead and type it in the questions panel, and we'll answer as many as we can. We're close to the end of the hour, but we can extend for a few questions. So we have a question from Colleen, who asks, so understanding that the Census Day and Enumeration Day are different dates, how do we, as researchers, distinguish between them? Is it safe to assume that the information on the form reflects ages as of the census date or the enumeration date?
Okay, so the census day was the day that was determined by the United States Census Bureau or whoever was in charge at the time. So, say for example, in 1840, the census day was the 1st of June. Now, when the enumerator got to a household, which it may have been, later on in the year, so say that he got there in August of 1840, that would be the enumeration day. Now, in some cases, that's recorded on the top of the census information. It's not always there on some of the older census records. However, the family should have been answering the questions that the census taker was asking based off of the date of the 1st of June, 1840, no matter what day he showed up. Now, I can't be sure if the census enumerator followed the instructions or not, or if the family understood the questions, but that should have been the way that everything was recorded.
All right. So now we have a question from Martha, who asks, she says that I've seen censuses with some names crossed out. So what might that mean?
Well, it could be that the person copying it made a mistake, and that name shouldn't have been there, or it could be that that was the original. In that case, unless you had the county copy, it's very difficult to make an estimation as to whether it was a copy or the original. In some cases, what you can do is look at all of the town schedules for that particular county and compare the handwritings for all of the towns, because depending on the census year, the same person should have been making the copies. So if the enumerator was giving it to his boss and his boss was the one making the copies, they should really all be in the same handwriting. So in that case, you can tell if it's the copy or if it was the original enumeration.
All right. And we have a question from Robert, who asks, were persons living in territories included in the census?
They should have been, if the person could get to them. So there's two different answers for that, I guess. So the United States was counting people who were in territories, yes. We tend to not, well, I guess more of the mistakes or more of the missing persons end up being in those rural territorial areas, mainly because the census enumerator might not have known that they were there, or they just might not have been able to get to them. So yes and no. They were taken, but in some cases they may not have been enumerated.
And Lucille asks, how did sailors or mariners get recorded, or were they recorded?
They should have been recorded in the household. So if someone was a mariner and they were at sea, during the enumeration, they should have been enumerated in that household. If someone is a member of the armed forces, they should have been enumerated on a particular base. However, I think that I read, and I may have to double check on this, but the 1950 census, I believe, will enumerate people that are overseas serving. So if someone was in the Army or in the Navy and they were serving overseas, they will be enumerated that way in those censuses.
Now, a few people have asked about using kind of the other schedules, like the agricultural schedule, the mortality, that kind of thing. Can you comment on using those schedules and for what censuses they exist?
Yes. So agricultural schedules were taken in 1850, 1860, 70, and 80. And in those cases, it's giving information usually about the head of household or the person who would have would have been the farmer or the owner of the property. So in those cases, you use them as much as you'd like. They tend to be a little bit more like those earlier censuses, like the tally mark censuses. It gives information about what they own, which is great, but it doesn't give much about, like their age or where they were born or things of that nature. There were some mortality schedules also taken 50, 60, 70, and 80. 18, I should mention, 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880. And it was the names of persons who died in the previous 12 months. So not that it's lucky for your ancestor, well, if you get lucky enough that your ancestor died in that 12-month time frame, there's some additional information that's included on that: age, race, gender, cause of death in some cases, the occupation of the person. So in that case, those can be very helpful as well.
Thank you. So maybe just a few more questions before we wrap up. Jody asks, if someone expressed Native American descent, would their name appear elsewhere on the census rather in the neighborhood where they were living? And if so, how would you locate that?
They should have been included on the census if they were, so if were they living on the reservation? Is that, I think if they were living on the reservation, they should have been enumerated there. I forget the first census where they did that, but I know that the earlier censuses, they were not enumerating Native Americans. It wasn't until a little bit later. Let me see if I can.
And because you're a lineage expert, I'll ask this question. So Dottie is asking, so to satisfy a lineage society like the DAR, is census information accepted as proof of a parent relationship, or does she have to locate a birth record independently of that information?
I will give my general answer for all lineage questions, and that would say it depends. It depends. So it depends on the availability of that vital record. So if you're dealing with New York, for example, and they didn't take vital records till 1880. Well, the 1880 census will distinguish the relationship between parents and children in the household. So in that case, if you're unable to find a vital record, then a census can be used to show a relationship as long as it's 1880 and onward. They won't take any of those other census records.
All right, one final question, and this was a good one. Robert asks, could a person refuse to be counted?
Well, yeah and no. So there's an interesting example of Boss Tweed. I found him on the 1880 census. He refused to answer any questions. And so the census enumerator wrote down all of the names of the individuals in the household and that was it, actually. It was just their names and their gender. And then very nicely on the side, the census enumerator said something to the effect of, after several attempts of trying to gain this information from the household, that we've basically given up. So in that case, in that case, yes, they did not want to answer any of the questions. Now, it doesn't necessarily get you out of being counted, but you can definitely refuse to answer some of the more individual questions.
All right, so if you'd like hands-on help with your research, you can always, you might want to consider scheduling a consultation with one of our experts or hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about these services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide, but I'll also include that information in my follow-up email to you tomorrow. Also in that follow-up email, I'll send a link to the recording so you can start reviewing the content as soon as tomorrow. I'll also include a link to the charts that, the comparison charts that Lindsay went over earlier in the presentation. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.